Peter Gabriel is a living legend who barely needs an introduction. He became well known as the lead singer of Genesis, and after that went on to have a successful solo career, gaining fame for using new music technology in innovative ways and hitting major commercial success with his fifth solo album, So, in 1986. An estimated 16 million Gabriel solo albums have been sold to date, including 7 million of So alone. Gabriel has been nominated for 21 Grammy Awards and won 6. He's also won 3 Brit Awards, 13 MTV Music Awards, and the Ivor Novello Award for Lifetime Achievement, and much, much more. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, with Genesis in 2010 and as a solo artist in 2014. Gabriel has also written the soundtracks for 4 movies and songs for almost 20 other movies, and is a champion of world music and world music artists. He is also a human rights activist who won the Man of Peace Award in 2006, which is related to the Nobel Peace Award. One side issue that Gabriel has also become famous for is procrastination. He once said, "Speed is not my strength, diversions are." And his name has become synonymous with the fact that many rock artists have been taking increasingly long to release new albums. Gabriel took 6 years between So and the follow-up Us, released in 1992. Another 10 years until the release of his next album of new material, Up, in 2002, which is still his most recent. At the time, Gabriel declared in interviews that another album of new material called I.O. was close to completion and would, in a sudden dramatic reversal of long-standing habit, see the light of day within 2 years. However, as Gabriel fans are all too well aware, the years went by without any sign of I.O. 8 years later, in 2010, there was an album of cover songs sung by Gabriel with an orchestra, Scratch My Back. Gabriel toured the album, also performing orchestral reinterpretations of his own songs, which were released a year later in 2011 on New Blood. Since then, Gabriel has toured regularly, released a couple of new songs, appeared on songs by One Republic and Arcade Fire, and 2019 saw the release of 2 compilation albums, Rated PG and Flotsam and Jetsam. Over the years, he occasionally discussed the possible release of a new studio album, but I.O. seemed to have become a never-ending procrastination story. With Gabriel turning 70 in 2020, it was widely assumed that the compilation albums were meant that he had more or less retired. Gabriel's surprise announcement on November the 8th, 2022, that he was planning a tour of Europe and North America to support the release of I.O. came, therefore, as a big shock. Fans the world over were pinching themselves, I know I was, wondering whether they could really believe their luck. Many tour dates have been since confirmed, with the first date of the European tour in Poland on May the 18th, 2023, and the last one in Ireland on June 25th. The American tour starts in Quebec on September the 8th and continues until the end of October this year, with dates still being added.
I'm now surrounded by a whole ton of new material. I've pretty much got an album ready, and it's been a lot of fun playing with the band again. And I'm excited about the idea of taking a lot of new material with me out on the road.
Meanwhile, there is yet no definite release date for I.O. If the album is indeed to be released in 2023, it will be an impressive 21 years since Up. However, Gabriel has this year been releasing 1 track from the album every full moon. The song Panopticon was released on January the 6th, followed by The Court, Playing for Time, and I.O. Another novelty is that each song is released in at least 3 different versions. A bright side mix by Spike Stent, a dark side mix by Chad Blake, and an immersive mix by Hans Martin Buff. With Peter Gabriel in the news again and regularly releasing new material, this is the perfect time to talk about his achievements, past and present. In this video, we will only briefly explore his background and his time with Genesis, as these were already covered in our recent Genesis video. There will be a link down below, so you can check that out if you haven't already. After that, we will look in depth at his solo work, with his many other activities and his latest releases.
Red rain is coming down.
Peter Brian Gabriel was born on the 13th of February 1950 in Surrey, in England, to Ralph and Edith Gabriel. His father was an electrical engineer and an inventor, and his mother gave him piano lessons. He has said that it was his dad's inventive spirit that inspired his later interest in working with the latest musical technology. The young Gabriel also learned to play drums and the flute. His singing talents were spotted at St Andrew's Prep School that he attended, and the hymns he sang there became a major influence. At the age of 13, he went to Charterhouse Boarding School in Godalming, Surrey, where he was a drummer and vocalist in several bands, starting with a jazz band called Milords, followed by the Spoken Word. In 1965, Gabriel teamed up with keyboardist Tony Banks and drummer Chris Stewart to form the band Garden Wall. 2 years later again, the three Garden Wall members joined forces with guitarist Anthony Phillips and bassist Mike Rutherford, and started working on new material. A former Charterhouse pupil called Jonathan King, who had enjoyed chart success in the UK, took an interest in the band, particularly in Gabriel's exceptional voice. King paid for and produced a number of sessions, and suggested the name Genesis. The resulting album with new drummer John Silver was called From Genesis Revelation, and released on Decca in 1968. It sold just 649 copies in its first year, and King and the band parted company. Silver was replaced by drummer John Mayhew, and the quintet recorded the album Trespass in 1970, which laid the blueprint for Genesis' unique prog rock sound. After the release of the album, Anthony Phillips left the band because of ill health and issues with stage fright, and Mayhew was asked to leave. The remaining three members recruited drummer Phil Collins and guitarist Steve Hackett as replacements. With this, the classic Genesis lineup was in place. Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Steve Hackett and Collins recorded 3 studio albums that built on the blueprint of Trespass. Nursery Crime in 1971, Foxtrot in 1972, and Selling England by the Pound in 1973. Each of these albums refined and further developed the musical direction of the album that went before, and many regard Selling England by the Pound as a career highlight, with Gabriel's vocals and melodies shining on the opening track, Dancing with the Moonlit Night. During his time in Genesis, Gabriel was the main face in the band, not only because he was the lead singer, but also because of his theatrical presence and the elaborate costumes that he wore, that often were inspired by characters in the songs. For example, The Moonlit Night, he wore a helmet, a shield, a cape, and a suit with the British flag.
I am the voice of Britain before the Daily Express.
All Genesis members contributed to the music, but many fans regarded Gabriel as the band's leader, which began to cause friction. This friction deepened with the band's next album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which was based on a concept and lyrics by Gabriel. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway was released in November of 1974 to general acclaim, and the band toured it with an elaborate live show, and Gabriel wearing some of the most outlandish costumes. After the tour in August of 1975, the news was published that Gabriel had left Genesis. The press release cited estrangement from the other band members, disillusionment with the music industry, and wanting to spend more time with his family as reasons. Interviews soon afterwards also made mention of Gabriel's desire to get into levitation, telepathy, ESP, UFOs, astrology, tarot, mysticism, and so on.
Well, I disappeared for a while and sort of got out of the music business and began to follow up some of the things that I'd lost touch with. Did some yoga, meditation things, gardening, making babies.
In the light of all these esoteric distractions, there was also widespread excitement and anticipation when news leaked out in 1976 that Gabriel was working on his first solo album. He had written a number of song demos and hit it off with producer Canadian Bob Ezrin, who had also worked with Lou Reed and Alice Cooper, and who would a couple of years later go on to work with Pink Floyd on The Wall.
Well, I saw a few people both over here and in America, and eventually I came across Bob Ezrin, who was a somewhat unlikely combination, as neither I was interested in his track record or he in mine.
Really?
But we got on very well, and He was enthusiastic about the songs.
Gabriel travelled to Canada in the autumn of 1976 to record his album at a studio in Toronto called The Soundstage. Ezrin had selected a number of top American session musicians that included bassist Tony Levin, drummer Alan Schwartzberg, percussionist Jimmy Malin, guitarist Steve Hunter, and keyboardists Larry Fast and Joey Chorowski. In a 2019 interview, Ezrin recalled, "Peter said, 'Can I have a Brit?' I said, 'Oh, okay. You can have one draft pick. Who do you want?' 'Well, I'd like Fripp.'" More British influences came in the shape of the London Symphony Orchestra, which performed on 2 songs, and recordings at Morgan and Olympic Studios in London. The core band that played on the album was varied in both nationalities and musical styles. I like to say that miracles happen when you have a confluence of disparate, brilliant personalities. These were as different as you could get. Everyone came from a different discipline and had a different background. But when they got together and started playing this stuff, which they did live in the studio, it was unbelievable, magical. Gabriel himself explained, "Suddenly to find myself in a studio full of serious musicians was unnerving. It took me 3 albums to get the confidence to find out what I could do that made me different from the other people. The first record really was a process of trying. I really wanted the first record to be different from what I had done with Genesis, so we were trying things in different styles."
I think initially I made a conscious decision to try and get away from sort of the arrangements that were associated with Genesis, in that the sound of the arrangements was as important as the songs themselves. And for me now, I'm trying to make it more simple, more direct, and the emphasis is on the songs.
Gabriel's self-titled debut solo album was released on February the 25th, 1977, and indeed contains a ragbag of styles, including the barbershop of Excuse Me, blues rock of Waiting for the One, the orchestral rock of Down the Dolce Vita, and the stadium rock of Here Comes the Flood. The opening track, Moribund the Burgermeister, has the most overt prog rock roots and sounds like something that could have been played by Genesis. The folk-influenced second track, Salisbury Hill, which is partly in 7/4, was the first single and has become, over time, one of Gabriel's most popular songs. It features a double-tracked acoustic guitar played by Steve Hunter. Alan Schwartzberg played a shaker with one hand and hitting a telephone directory with a drumstick with the other. And Larry Fast played a fake drum kit on one of his synths, which he has called a synthabomb. Gabriel plays flute and recorder. Salisbury Hill became a hit in the UK, reaching number 13, and the album was top 10 in the UK and several other European countries. It meant that Gabriel had established himself as a viable solo artist. Other notable tracks are Modern Love, Humdrum, and Here Comes the Flood. Gabriel was unhappy with the bombastic production, and after the song was presented in 1979 as a piano ballad on Robert Fripp's Exposure solo album, he has performed it in this minimalistic setting. Towards the end of 1977, Gabriel set about recording a follow-up album. The sessions took place over several winter months at Relight Studios in Hilvarenbeek in the Netherlands, with Robert Fripp producing and playing electric guitar. Guitarist was keen to speed up the recording process and was also instrumental in the drier-sounding, more direct production, which was reminiscent of the King Crimson albums of 1972 to 74. The album was mixed at the Hit Factory in New York and Trident Studios in London. Released in June of 1978, Gabriel's second album was again self-titled because he wanted the focus to be on the artwork and felt that printed titles distracted from this. Instead, he looked at every release as another issue of the same magazine. To distinguish himself between the albums, fans started calling the first album Car and the second album Scratch. These informal titles have gradually become formalized and are now used on streaming platforms. Gabriel's second album was less well received critically than his debut, and also did less well commercially, reaching number 10 in the UK and landing well outside the top 10 in most other countries. However, over time, appreciation of the album has grown, quite rightly. Highlights include the full frontal opening track, On the Air. The first single, DIY. The gorgeous and poignant ballads, Mother of Violence.
Fear, she's the mother of violence.
and Home Sweet Home.
Sweet home.
The dramatic Animal Magic. And the reggae-ish A Wonderful Day in a One-Way World.
Have a wonderful day in a one-way world.
Gabriel's third album was the big one from the creative point of view. It has become known as Melt, again because of its cover, and the first album which Gabriel truly developed a unique direction in music. Gabriel remembered, the third album was quite important for me in terms of really having a defining sound. It was the first record where I was clearly doing something different from what other people were doing. Recordings took place at Gabriel's home studio in Ashcombe House near Bath in West England, using Manor mobile equipment, which included a Helios 4024 desk, and also at the Townhouse Studios in London. Steve Lillywhite was producing and Hugh Padgham was at the controls. Gabriel had asked them because he had enjoyed the work the two had done on XTC's Drums and Wires album in 1979. Gabriel's writing process was radically different from how he had worked before. He tended to write the songs at the piano. Now he started from the drums and worked his way upwards from there. This was the result of a newfound interest in world music, as well as the emergence of drum machines. There were other inspirations as well. As Gabriel explained, one of my influences at that time was some of the systems music that was beginning to evolve. Steve Reich had done this wonderful record called Music for 18 Musicians in 1978. Of all the systems composers, his work had a lot of textures and colours and grooves that I really responded to. So I tried to involve elements of that in the work. Looking for a new drum sound on his album, Gabriel asked drummers Phil Collins and Jerry Marotta not to use cymbals, because he did not want their high splashy sounds, and also because, as he remarked in an interview, artists given complete freedom die a horrible death. So when you tell them what they can't do, they get creative. This creative restriction made an extremely lucky accident possible that would change the world of music. It happened at Townhouse Studio 2, with Phil Collins on drums. They had just bought an early SSL desk at a time when the company was still in its infancy. It was the first desk with compressors and noise gates on every channel. Here's Hugh Padgham 2 years ago giving me the story of what happened next.
One of the gimmicks on this desk was it had what's called a reverse talkback button. And when I say a gimmick, any console before, if you wanted to listen to somebody talking to you in the studio, you had to actually plug a microphone up into a channel of the desk. And even though you had the other way round, you always had talkback so you could speak to them in the headphones or speakers or whatever. No one had ever thought of this idea of having a microphone permanently plugged into the console. So all you had to do was press a button and you could hear what somebody was saying. So you didn't have to waste a channel, and B, you didn't have to bring the channel up and down all the time and make sure you hadn't recorded it onto the hi-hat track by mistake or something like that. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
So and then the idea of this listen mic reverse talkback thing was that we had two studio areas, and so there was the ability to plug two microphones in, and in order to hear anybody talking at any place in whichever studio they were in, they developed this massively huge compressor, which was then so it wasn't designed to be recorded at all. So one day during the Peter Gabriel album, Phil's in there playing the drums. We already had rule number 1 on that album was there were no cymbals allowed. This was Peter, before it started. No hi-hats, no cymbals. And that is a big, I'll come to that in a minute, a big thing about this drum sound. So one day, Phil's tuning his drums up, messing around, and I pressed the reverse talkback button for whatever reason to hear him or his roadie talking. And suddenly there's this sound that comes out of the monitors. And everyone goes, bloody hell, you know, that's unbelievable. Let's have some of that. And I said, well, sadly, we can't have some of that because it's rooted to the monitor matrix. I can't record it. I'm really sorry, unless we put a microphone in front of the, you know, monitor speaker. So that night, I said to the maintenance engineer on duty, can you please get the schematics out of the board and see if you can get a feed off this mic and put it into a patch point, a spare patch point on the console. And that's what he did. Literally the next day, he did that. And so we were suddenly able to get that sound and put it on tape. So therefore, then I put it into a channel, and then I was mucking around with even more compression and the noise gate that was on the SSL channel. And that's when we discovered the thing of it closing down, because he played something and then it just suddenly shut off. And going from a really ambient sound to nothing in like a couple of milliseconds or whatever it was like really, you know, as you know, a sort of strange sort of sounding phenomenon. So basically, we then, Phil got a drum pattern. So Peter says, okay, get a drum pattern together. So he got this drum pattern together that worked with the noise gate shutting off, because if he played it too fast, the gate wouldn't have had time to shut off. So we kind of fiddled around and it came up with this drum pattern, which then Phil played to a metronome. I mean, we're talking very early days of drum machines and all that. And I think he played to a metronome that we had that was there for orchestration purposes. You know, when you used to be doing jingles or things like that, and the conductor would want a metronome, which was really a horrible sort of spike. Anyway, so we got the tempo together on the metronome, so you keep that. And he literally then played for about, I don't know, probably 10 minutes or something. So that drum sound, there's no editing, there's no looping, there's no nothing. It's just Phil playing literally for 5 or 10 minutes, and then Peter wrote the song around it.
Oh wow!
And that's how that happened. And then and Phil was so impressed with this, and it sounded, you know, like no one had ever, you know. So you know, I obviously sort of impressed him enough for him 6 months later, when he wanted to make his own solo record, that he then asked me to produce it with him. And so, you know, talk about luck and being in the right place at the right time, and these phenomenons happening.
The famous gated drum sound was born and made possible by the fact that there were no cymbals, which the compressor would otherwise have pushed across everything. As Padgham explained, the gated drum sound was not only the foundation of Intruder, which became the opening track of Gabriel's third record, but Phil Collins and Padgham soon used it again on another monster hit, In the Air Tonight, which we covered in an earlier video. Gabriel's focus on rhythm was also inspired by the cheap Pyre drum machine, which was the world's first programmable drum machine. In addition, Gabriel was the very first British musician to have obtained a Fairlight CMI, i.e. a computer musical instrument, the first piece of gear that was capable of sampling. As a result, some for the time very unusual sounds made their way onto the album. Everything came together in a series of incredibly strong and adventurous tracks with the help of the latest technology and some of the world's top players, including keyboardist Larry Fast, guitarist David Rhodes and Robert Fripp, bassist John Giblin, and drummers Jerry Marotta and Phil Collins. In addition to the menacing Intruder, these tracks include No Self-Control, on which Gabriel worked with percussionist Maurice Pert to apply some of the principles of systems music. While it's easy to imagine the Fairlight being the source of some of the weirder sounds on this track, in fact, they were the result of the distortion produced by a small £9.95 Radio Shack speaker. Another standout track is I Don't Remember, with Tony Levin on Chapman Stick and featuring the sounds of milk bottles being smashed and bricks being hit that had been sampled into the Fairlight CMI. Notable other tracks are Family Snapshot, Games Without Frontiers, Kate Bush on backing vocals, and featuring a Roland CR78 Compu Rhythm drum machine. The closing song is Gabriel's first protest song, Biko, about the murdered South African anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko. The song incorporated a Brazilian surdo drum played by Phil Collins in an attempt to approximate African rhythms, as well as bagpipes recreated on a synth by Larry Fast.
The traditional rock rhythms were very limiting, but in the Biko song, I took a slow rhythm, which was a hypnotic pattern for me. It went dum 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 da, dum 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 da, and this was very good to work around, and I could set other rhythms against it. It provided a solid structure for me, and I think the rhythm is like the spine of a piece. If you change that, then the body that forms around it is changed as well. So the style of writing, which I was then attracted to put with it, was very different from what I would have done with a normal rock rhythm if that had come from a regular rock pattern on a rhythm box or rock drummer. I think a lot of rock rhythms are built up around 4 and a bar, and a lot of non-European work more on a pulse basis, and they perhaps have different instruments which are like pieces of a jigsaw which form a pattern, a whole, which an individual part cannot provide you with. So, and I think the variation and the range is much more stimulating. In a lot of rock and disco, there's this very heavy, tight bass drum and backbeat from a snare. And this is the foundation for most of the music that you'd hear in a disco, for instance. And yet there are rhythms which are just as exciting to the body, but are just, that create the same sort of responses, but are much more imaginative and open.
When the album was completed, the music turned out to be far too challenging for Gabriel's American record company. One record executive at Atlantic Records deemed it not commercial enough for release. And the label's founder, the legendary Ahmet Erdogan, to which Led Zeppelin dedicated their O2 Arena concert in 2007, asked, "Has Peter been in a mental hospital?" Atlantic refused to release the album in the US, and it was issued on Mercury Records. Peter Gabriel's third solo album was released in May of 1980, and critically immediately well received. It was a significant commercial success as well, going to number 1 in the UK and France, and 22 in the US. Games Without Frontiers went to number 4 in the UK, and Biko has become one of Gabriel's most important anthems. Biko had a major impact on the music scene in general, and even on international politics. It became one of the theme songs of the anti-apartheid movement, and inspired many other acts to write anti-apartheid songs. Gabriel's interest in world music led him to found the WOMAD Festival in 1980. WOMAD stands for World of Music, Arts and Dance. And the first festival took place in 1982, with the participation of a large amount of world music artists. For several reasons, turnout was low, and WOMAD and Gabriel were facing bankruptcy. The other members of the classic lineup of Genesis agreed to perform a benefit concert for WOMAD, which took place in Milton Keynes on October the 2nd, 1982. The proceeds paid back the debt, and Gabriel could continue his solo career. Gabriel had meanwhile been busy working on his fourth solo album with a similar set of musicians as on his third, including David Rhodes on guitar, Larry Fast on keyboards, Jerry Marotta on drums, and Tony Levin on bass and Chapman Stick, and Maurice Pert on percussion. Recordings again took place at his Ashcombe House studio near Bath, which by now had a Decca console. The main change was that David Lord engineered and co-produced the album with Gabriel. It was a slightly strange pairing, as Lord was at the time known as a classical composer and arranger. He later went on to work with Tears for Fears, XTC, Jean-Michel Jarre, and Peter Hamel. Gabriel explained that Lord was very good with textures and sounds. A lot of time, as always, I had been noodling away, and he was quite good at helping forge through that. Two influences that Gabriel had started to explore on his third album were centre stage on his fourth: world music and the sampling technology of the Fairlight. Gabriel explains his thinking in this clip from a TV documentary about the making of his fourth album. Gabriel enters the studio, which is a converted cowshed next to Ashcombe House, with David Lord also visible, as well as a lot of equipment from the era.
I'm certain the third world is going to have an increasing influence on our culture. And in music, a very vigorous hybrid will be produced, which is based on this non-European influence and the new technology, which is going to get very, very cheap. And this facility will open up a new age of electronic skiffle.
Well, hi there. Yeah. Initially, when you first come into the studio, it's like walking into another world and a mass of knobs and buttons which are totally foreign. And then as you spend more and more time in the studio, you learn what they all do and how to manipulate them to come up with things which are very different from the noises that first went in there.
At this point in the process, much the most important tool for me is this drum machine or the rhythm box. This allows me, with the sound of real drums, to store in computer memory any drum pattern I can conceive of or steal and use this as the basis for my songwriting.
And in this video clip, which is part of a TV documentary about the making of Gabriel's fourth album, the artist explains the basics of the Fairlight to an audience for who the entire idea of sampling was still completely new.
Say, if I pick up this mic, for an example, and press S for sample, we can put in the sound, I hope. Mummy! Over here we have Mummy, the waveform, and it should be up on the keyboard.
Just the wind on the pipe is quite nice. Yeah.
I think we did it. Oh, it looks good. Yeah, all the sounds on this thing are stored on these floppy disks, and some of these are supplied with the machine. This has a list of all the different sounds available on this floppy disk. So I pull out my phallic symbol here and point it at the appropriate noise. Say this is Pet Swan, which is a modified Swanee whistle. There's a repeat built into it, and the rhythm of the repeat is something which really really excited me, and I've written a song around the rhythms. So there, I was thinking of a rhythm that would go against it.
The track Gabriel demonstrates here is an album's opening track, Rhythm of the Heat, in which the Fairlight and world music influences are dramatically in evidence. In another interview, Gabriel explained, Rhythm of the Heat was based on a story of Carl Jung going to Africa and becoming so mesmerized by some drums that he felt he'd lost himself and become part of this dancing mass. So it was this really important Western mind losing himself in something more primitive and more instinctive. In the music, we tried to do that as well. And the track ends up in this big African drum explosion with the Ecom Dance Company. Rhythm of the Heat was the embodiment of a juxtaposition that has continued to be at the heart of Gabriel's musical journey to this day. As he explained in a recent interview about his forthcoming I.O. album, "I've always liked this high-tech, handmade combination. You mix the future with something physical from the past, and some really interesting things come to life in that space." Other key tracks on the album are the hypnotic San Jacinto, about the clash between native and modern American cultures, featuring a Fairlight loop and marimbas.
Indian ground, so far down.
The rhythmic I Have the Touch,
I have the touch.
and the main single from the album, Shock the Monkey,
Don't you know you're gonna shock the monkey?
which saw Gabriel using a Linn LM1 drum machine and a Prophet 5 synthesizer. Gabriel's fourth solo album was 18 months in the making, in part because of Gabriel's indecisiveness, as Lord explains.
He's a slow worker, and I think the main problem is he likes to keep every possible option open as long as he can.
Because I always think that tomorrow I will find the way in which it works perfectly. And he's been forcing me to make decisions.
I hope very much to try and interpret his ideas, because I don't really think he needs very many of mine. I think people seem to think they need producers, but I think it's more a liaison between what he wants to get and the technical problems.
While his fourth album again had no title in most territories, Gabriel was persuaded to call it Security for the US market. The album was released in September 1982, and it reached number 6 in the UK and 28 in the US. It received mixed reviews, with critics claiming that it was less coherent and pioneering than his previous album. However, over time, the album has become regarded as one of Gabriel's best and most pioneering solo efforts. At the time, Gabriel was very much locked in the regular touring and releasing albums routine that was at the heart of the careers of most artists and bands. To keep the release momentum going, 1983 saw the release of his first live album, Plays Live. Gabriel's next album was a dramatic departure and the result of film director Alan Parker asking him to provide the music to the movie Birdie. Because Gabriel knew the music would be ambient and instrumental in nature, he enlisted Canadian producer and multi-instrumentalist Daniel Lanois to help him. Lanois was at the time gaining fame for his work with Brian Eno and Harold Budd. While Gabriel and Lanois started to work on the Birdie soundtrack at the end of 1984, Lanois had just come out of working with Eno on U2's The Unforgettable Fire. Did you end up working with Peter Gabriel through Eno, or was that came from yourself? How did that all come together?
I got to work with Peter Gabriel on the recommendation of David Rhodes, and David is a guitar player with Peter,
Fantastic.
a great musician and really a brilliant mind, and somebody who keeps an ear to the ground. And he suggested, because I went to work with Peter to do a soundtrack for a film called Birdie, and David, I believe, said, consider this kid because he's been doing some very inventive work, sonically out there. And David had heard my work with Eno.
Gabriel explained Lanois came, in part, from the Brian and Eno school of record production, which is always creating unusual processing out of equipment and using it in a way totally different from what it was designed to be used. Lanois, I just took Peter's multi-track tapes that he had on the shelf and just listened through them, flipped them around and did this and that. I slowed them down, sped them up, and found just a few things that I thought were nice and did some mixes. A lot of them he really liked and they got used in the film. Peter knew that I had developed a skill for that sort of work, and that's why he got me in to do it. Gabriel also wrote some of the new material, and the result was Birdie, released in March of 1985, that alternated between slow, dark, ambient moods and occasional intense percussion moments. In the beginning of 1985, Gabriel started work on So, the album that would propel him from cult artist to one of the world's most famous rock stars. Gabriel again asked Lanois to help with the production, and together with guitarist David Rhodes, the three spent half a year working out new material at the Ashcombe House cowshed. Although Gabriel still drew on the world music and new music technology elements of his previous albums, his focus this time was on writing more traditional songs that would suit him as a singer, and that honoured the soul and rhythm and blues music that had influenced him in his childhood.
I think there's a lighter, bouncier, more playful feel in the music. I think it's more a songwriter's album and less to do with sound than some of the previous records.
According to Lanois, the album was created with a fairly limited supply of tools. Most of the keyboards are acoustic piano, Yamaha electric piano, a Prophet 5, and an old Fairlight Series 2 with some good sampled sounds. So has a variety of sounds and is a lesson in not necessarily using wildly different instruments or components to come up with variety, but using a concentrated small area and drawing a lot from them. It's a mysterious album. If you listen closely, there aren't that many unusual instruments on it, but it sounds sonically innovative. In addition to the instruments Lanois mentioned, Gabriel used 3 Lindrum machines, the 9000, LM1 and the Lindrum, as well as an EMU Emulator 2 sampler, and a Yamaha CS80. His pianos were a Yamaha CP70 and a CP80 piano. After a few months of work, Lanois asked Irish engineer Kevin Killen to step in as an engineer. Killen, who had also worked on the Unforgettable Fire, recalls the cowshed was really cold. When I arrived, there were 2 Studer A80 analog 24-track tape machines. There was an Adam Smith 2600 synchronizer that had problems to get the 2 machines to talk to each other. The way we worked was that Peter had a demo with maybe a Prophet 5 pad and a Lindrum on tape machine 1, and then musicians would play along and I'd record their parts on the other machine. By this time, Ashcombe House had an SSL 4048E series mixing desk with Yamaha NS10 monitors, and Killen recorded Gabriel's voice with a Neumann Tube U47, going through an old Decca compressor that came from the previous desk. The engineer said the Decca compressors were kind of like an LA2A, very smooth, very slow. I set it up for a minimum amount of compression. Because of the sync problems, the recording material was later transferred to a digital 32-track Mitsubishi X850 tape recorder. Killen remembered, the process of getting stuff from slave reel number 5 to master reel number 1 sometimes involved lining up both 2-inch tape machines and flying between them manually, bit by bit. In July, we got an AMS sampler with 14 seconds of sampling time, so we could actually sample 4 or 5 measures of music and then fly it in that way, which helped. So featured several of the same musicians as on Security, including Tony Levin, David Rhodes, and Jerry Marotta. In addition, there's also Manu Cachet and Stuart Copeland on drums, Lanois and Nile Rodgers on guitar, and many other musicians and singers. Gabriel and Lanois also went to the Power Station Studios, New York, to record the Memphis horns and some piano and keyboards, with particular focus on the Stax-like horns for Sledgehammer. While Gabriel and Lanois were in New York, Killen continued transferring all the material to the Mitsubishi. By September, we had everything over to the 32-track machine. We also were always mixing and ended up using material from all 3 tape recorders because Peter felt some things sounded better coming off analog tape, particularly certain percussion elements, and he was right. Outboard gear that was used during tracking and mixing of So included an EMT 140 echo plate, an AMS DMX 1580, an RMX 16, an Eventide H910 harmonizer, Korg SDD 3000 and SDE 320 digital delays, a Delta Labs DL2 delay, a Lexicon 224 reverb, 4 Decca compressors, DBX 160 compressors, Universal Audio LA2A, Quantec Room Simulator, Sony DRE 1000 reverb, as well as a Revox B77 quarter-inch, and Ampex ATR 100 half-inch tape machine. While the latest music technology was less featured on So than his previous 2 studio albums, it was still at the heart of Gabriel's approach. In this 1986 video, he once again explains his rationale.
To what extent are you interested in the latest gadgets, the latest computer gear?
I'm very, very interested because I think it is like seeing a revolution take place that is as fundamental as the Industrial Revolution, and it's only just beginning. So I think the opportunities that it presents to anyone in all areas shouldn't be underestimated at all. I mean, either the technology is made our ally or it's our enemy, and
I think life will be a lot happier if we make it our ally and come to grips with it.
For the public, the first sign of Gabriel's dramatic shift in musical direction came with the release of the album's lead single, Sledgehammer, in 1986, which hit the music world, well, like a sledgehammer, and opened the path for Gabriel towards major stardom. Also helped by an extraordinary and very innovative video, the funky masterpiece, full of sexual innuendo, spent 4 weeks at #1 in the US Billboard charts, and it reached to #4 in the UK. The song has become an all-time classic and yielded Gabriel 3 Grammy Award nominations. The video received 9 MTV Music Awards. So was released in May of 1986. Gabriel commented on the short name in different ways.
You do have a title this time, at least. Instead
That's
of just
right.
your name, it's called So.
It's perhaps an anti-title, but yeah, I thought indecisiveness is one of my more normal occupations, and to title or not to title has been worrying me for a couple of weeks, but I went for a title partly just to try and introduce the idea of a change. And so it's short, has no meaning, and a nice shape.
With Sledgehammer high in the charts around the world, So went to #1 in many countries, including the UK. It reached #2 in the US. Almost all reviews were exceptionally positive. The second single, In Your Eyes, which had strong African influences and Youssou N'Dour on guest vocals, did at the time not have much impact, but the third single, the poignant ballad Don't Give Up, with Kate Bush sharing lead vocals, became another hit and another classic Gabriel track. Oh, and by the way, In Your Eyes is a classic. The fourth single was the funky track, Big Time, and it also did well. By the time the album opener, Red Rain, was released as a single, more than a year after the album, the momentum had gone, despite the fact that the song continues to be regarded as a highlight of Gabriel's career. The second ballad on the album, Mercy Street, was also a fan favourite. So was nominated for Grammy Award Album of the Year. Gabriel built on the success of So in several different ways. He used his newfound star profile to support humanitarian causes, for example by participating in the Conspiracy of Hope tour in 1986 with the Police and U2, and the Human Rights Now World tour in 1988 with Sting, Bruce Springsteen, Tracy Chapman and Youssou N'Dour. In addition, he invested part of the large amount of revenue that rolled in as a result of having a worldwide hit album in building his dream studio, which he called Real World. Gabriel bought a property not far from Ashcombe House, on which there was a 200-year-old sawmill. It was extensively rebuilt to contain several studios and offices, and so on. Most spectacularly, there was a large addition to the building, mostly made of glass and metal, that became Studio One. The huge square feet, light-filled space inside has a floor surface of more than 2,000 square feet, which is about 200 square meters, with 10-meter high ceilings. At the time, it had a large wraparound 80-channel SSL 4000G series console. Today, it is a 72-channel 9000K desk. The studio is set up as a combined writing, recording, and mixing space. In the 70s, recording studios tended not to have any daylight, and control rooms that were entirely separate from the recording spaces. In the early 80s, Daniel Lanois was one of several musicians and producers declared vibe and performance more important than technology, and for who this reason liked to record in unusual places, with the engineers, producers and musicians all over the same room. The recordings at Slane Castle for U2's The Unforgettable Fire were an example. Gabriel's Real World was the first major recording studio purposely built with these principles in mind. The first music that Gabriel recorded at his new studio was for the Martin Scorsese movie, The Last Temptation of Christ. After the movie's release in 1988, Gabriel spent several more months further developing the music. He was helped in all of this by David Bottrell, who had worked as Lanois' assistant on So. Bottrell remembers, I think we would have had a very different record if we hadn't the quality and versatility of Real World to record it in. The studio made my job a lot easier. The larger spaces allowed for people to all play together in the same room. Peter wanted to lose the separation between the recording spaces and the sonic sculpture spaces, remove the wall of glass between the artist and the technology. This was why the control rooms were a size that could mostly accommodate both. And here's David Bottrill earlier this year sharing some of his memories with me of working on the album.
Maybe the first thing that people picked up on a lot as being a sort of unique set of recordings was the soundtrack to The Last Temptation of Christ that Peter wrote called The Passion.
Love that album. I bought it when it came out. Absolutely beautiful
thank
album.
You. Yeah, I love it too. And I'm it's one of the ones I'm most proud of, funnily enough. And a lot of people have used that record for putting in into a movie that they're working on. They'll use it as a working track, that sort of thing. And then when they contact a composer to work on it, they'll say, we want it to be kind of like this, or something along that lines. But it's a real honor that a lot of people have used that kind of like a source for certain things.
How long did that take to record? Was that, I suppose I'm sort of jokingly asking, because when I talk to Tony, Hugh Padgham, Steve, Lillywhite, about working with Peter Gabriel, it's always the same thing. It's amazing, the best work we've ever done, but it can be a process.
It's very much a process. That one was actually one of the shorter ones, funnily enough. It only took about a year.
That's a great answer.
Because there was a film deadline, right? We had a film deadline to meet, and so we did a lot of very fast working. A lot of musicians came in from all over the world to play on it, and then we relocated at the end of the film recording process to New York, and we set up in the Brill Building a studio there, and so we could run picture. And then when we put it to the film, we sent it up to the dubbers. Like we'd finish they'd finish a scene, we'd finish an edit up there, and then we get the music done, send it up. They would dub it in. We would carry on like that till the end of the film process was done. Then we took all the tapes, went back to it, and then reworked them all for the album. And that took another about 2 or 3 months after the film was done, was wrapped.
Passion was released in June of 1989 as the first on Real World Records, another new Gabriel venture. It featured well-known world music musicians like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, Youssou N'Dour, El Shankar, Bob Mamal, and many more, as well as Western musicians like drummer Billy Cobham, keyboardist David Sancious, drummer Manu Katché, trumpeter John Hassell, and guitarist David Rhodes. Passion earned Gabriel his first Grammy Award for Best New Age Performance, but it was not anywhere near as commercially successful as So. However, Gabriel later remarked, "This was one of the most important records for me, an opportunity as a writer to try and do a different sort of job than I usually do." In October 1989, Gabriel started work on his sixth solo album, which was released 3 years later as Us. Just like So, it was another short, almost anti-title. Naturally, the album was recorded at Real World for the most part in Gabriel's workroom, which was equipped with the same 48-channel E-Series SSL console which had been in the Ashcombe House cowshed. Lanois was again producing, and David Bottrill again at the controls. Bottrill, Lanois, and guitarist David Rhodes are all visible in this video clip shot at Real World with Lanois talking.
Gabriel was about to do a soundtrack for a film called Birdie. He was interested in someone who could manipulate sound and take some of his existing multi-tracks and transform them. That's how the relationship with Peter started. And then another phone call from him, and we went on to do yet another record.
And here's Gabriel talking about Lanois.
I think Daniel is a great producer, and perhaps one of his best qualities is his ear for magic. He knows how to push me, and both musically and lyrically, and perhaps further than I might go on my own.
The recording gear consisted of Studer 820 24-track tape machines running at 30 IPS with Dolby SR, a Mitsubishi X850 32-track digital tape recorder, a Waveframe audio frame DAW was used for digital editing. Because Gabriel liked to record everything that was happening, many of the recordings were transferred to DAT, aka digital audio tape. Bottrill and Lanois ended up having to keep track of an amazing 1,000 DAT tapes. Gabriel's rig for the session consisted of a Yamaha CP80 electric piano, Akai S1000 and S1100 samplers, which replaced the Fairlight, an Akai MPC60, a Sequential Circuits Prophet 5, a Roland D50, and a Korg wave station. All this gear went through a 16-input DDA-S series PA mixing desk, which was fed stereo into the SSL. Famously, Lanois had lost his patience with the forever procrastinating Gabriel during the recordings of So, at one point smashing the singer's phone on the mixing desk, at another moment locking him in a cupboard to try and force him to finish some lyrics. For Lanois, it was not only a matter of things taking too long and him wanting to get on with other commitments, but also about completing an album at the right moment.
During a project, there will be a peak moment. There'll be several peak moments, but you'll have your grand peak. That's where you want to finish the record. That's where you want the conclusion to be. If it goes beyond that, you may lose the strength and acquire more ornament. That's a serious mistake. If you end up with something that's not as good as what it can be, but very polished, that's quite a sin artistically. The ability to know where that peak is, it's very important.
Looking back later, Lanois was definitely not impressed with the 3 years it took to finish Us either. It was a tough record to make because of distractions. Too many board meetings, architects going around with drawings, feeding the ducks. It was a frustrating time. I don't like distractions very much. I've seen distractions destroy a lot of careers. The complexities surrounding Peter at that point made it hard and probably made it so we wouldn't be working together again. Us again featured long-standing collaborators and live band members, Tony Levin, David Rhodes and Manu Katché, but also a large amount of additional musicians, including William Orbit on programming, Brian Eno on keyboards, Hossam Ramsey on percussion, Caroline Lavelle on cello, and Leo Nocentelli on guitar, and many more. Leo from the Meters, amazing. When Us was finally released in September 1992, it was immediately apparent that it was very different to So. The pop leanings had made way for a far more personal record, with the singer commenting in an interview,
"It was at the end of a period in which my marriage had broken up and another relationship I'd been in had failed, and so I was looking into myself and doing some group therapy work and really starting to try and understand what my part was in all this stuff. And I think given that it was preoccupation for a number of years, I thought it was the right thing to put it out. And also as an English male who had a certain amount of cynicism and reserve and fear about doing any work on myself, I actually realized that I got a lot out of it, and I was hoping that it might encourage other people to consider that.
As with So, many of the most important tracks on Us were released as singles, starting with the soul-searching Digging in the Dirt.
Digging in the dirt, find the places I got hurt.
The Sledgehammer remake Steam.
Give me steam, and how you feel can make it real.
The ballad Blood of Eden with Sinead O'Connor, which could be seen as the remake of Don't Give Up.
And all the while the distance grows between you and me.
Kiss That Frog.
Don't you know that this tongue can kill? Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
And Come Talk to Me.
Come on, come talk to me. Oh, please talk to me.
Other notable tracks are Washing of the Water and Secret World. Us has been called Gabriel's difficult album, and it was not surprising that it was less commercially successful than So. However, Us made it to number 2 in both the US and UK charts, and has to date sold 2.5 million copies. The album resulted in 4 Grammy nominations and 2 Grammy Awards, the latter for the videos for Digging in the Dirt and Steam. Even though it was less commercially successful than So, Us still provided Gabriel with enough of a platform to get off the touring and album release treadmill, and diversify his activities even further. In the 30 years since the release of Us, Gabriel has been preoccupied with many other activities than making music, which explains the fact that he has only released 1 solo album since then. In the 90s, Gabriel stated that music only preoccupied 1/3 of his time, and the rest of his focus was on humanitarian work and his label. Over time, Gabriel's activities have scattered in more and more directions, to the point that he is today involved in dozens of different activities, companies, and charities. To keep this narrative focused on the music, we will mention only some of them in passing, although they are all absolutely incredible. 2 examples: Witness, a human rights advocacy non-profit organisation, which Gabriel founded in 1992. Later that decade, Gabriel and Richard Branson brainstormed on an organisation of world elder statesmen and women to work towards peace, justice, human rights, and a sustainable planet. It finally was founded in 2007 together with Nelson Mandela. It is still going and called The Elders. To get back to the musical front, following the release of Us, Gabriel supported the album with a Secret World Tour, a live recording and a video of the tour called Secret World Live, which was released in 1994 and yielded another Grammy Award for Best Long-Form Music Video. Following this, Gabriel co-founded the CD-ROM-based entertainment company Explorer, and he and the Real World co-created a music and art adventure video game called Eve that was released in 1997. Also in 1997, Gabriel was invited to provide the soundtrack for and co-write a multimedia event at the Millennium Dome in London called the Millennium Dome Show. It was performed 999 times over the course of 2000. Corresponding soundtrack album, Ovo, was released in June of the same year. Ovo was influenced by folk music, but also featured rap and other influences, and a huge list of contributors, some of them well known, like Nina Cherry, Richie Havens, and Alison Goldfrapp, but it was only moderately well received, but contained standout tracks like Father, Son, The Tower, The Eight People, and Downside Up. Gabriel had to interrupt work on his 7th solo album to have the time to create Ovo. In fact, in line with his self-declared love of diversions, he accepted another diversion when he was asked to provide the soundtrack for the Australian movie Rabbit Proof Fence. Gabriel spent part of 2000 and 2001 recording the music for the movie again, working with a large amount of contributors, including Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and the Blind Boys of Alabama. The atmospheric and brooding end result was released in April 2002 under the title Long Walk Home, music from the Rabbit Proof Fence. Gabriel had, in fact, started writing material for the follow-up to Us as early as 1995, with writing sessions in Méribel in France, Senegal, and in a boat along the Amazon River. He used a portable recording setup manned by Richard Chappell, who had become his engineer and right-hand man. The equipment they brought over from the real world included a Mackie 48-channel mixer, a 32-track Pro Tools system, a few ADATs, and 3 Macintosh 8100 computers, one with Pro Tools and Logic for backups, and one for writing lyrics and going on the internet. Gabriel's own setup at the time included an Akai MPC 3000 and an MPC C60, a Kurzweil 2000 sampler, and keyboard controller, which he updated to the 2500 and later the 2600. He also had a Clavier Nord lead, many Korg keyboards like the Wavestation 01W and the Triton, plus an emulator 4 sampler and a UVI waveframe. Chappell and Gabriel continued work on the album at Real World in the writing room, also called the Garden Shed, which was built a few hundred yards away from the main studio to offer the singer some more privacy and freedom. After a second trip to France, a digital Sony Oxford 3 was installed in the Garden Shed, with Neil Grant Boxer 3 and Mackie HR824 Neil-Field monitors. Here are some brief clips of Richard Chappell giving a tour of the Garden Shed around the time.
We just found, due to the fact that the studio was getting busier and busier, that Peter really needed a permanent place to come, so we moved in here. But I think in real world tradition, you know, it's very much, it's a lovely space, and then you go from a lovely space to make it work technically afterwards. So, which I think that's our appeal. So, you know, it's a lovely space to be in. Whenever people come around, they get it, they understand it. And, you know, it's basically a big wooden room on legs with a curved ceiling with grass on the roof. Got a desk, a vintage digital desk, I must say. A Sony Oxford, and this actually, a lot of people turn up now and they kind of go, oh, look, it's that looks just like the plug-in. And it's actually, yeah, but this was actually before the plug-in, which we're very proud to say. And that was, you know, we had these before we had these, and people started laughing, going, why did you get one of those? But now everybody realised that the EQ and all of the, I guess, Sonics now plugins people really like, and we've got them all built in, so it works really well. We've got analog front ends, like, you know, this kind of stuff over here. We've always got a bunch of Neves. This is from a console that we used to have. We've got these spread around the place upstairs in the other room and here, and some Seventh Circle stuff, the API stuff. So we've always got a nice front end to play with. This is kind of looking at the way that Peter wants to run any of his studios, and it's all kind of based around this kind of real world concept that kind of you see the extreme in the big room, where all of the engineering and all of the technical work is done in the centre of the room, and all the performance then happens in and out of that and around that. And Peter really likes having a space where he can have a bunch of gear and we can just work and just have fun and get on with the music. And there's no glass and there's no talk back and there's no, it's not like music here and technical here. Everything's one thing. And this is like a perfect example of that.
Gabriel ended up with more than 130 song ideas and sketches, some of which found their way to the OVO and Long Walk Home albums. OVO, Long Walk Home, and the album he was working on, Up, were Gabriel's first entirely self-produced efforts, a situation that did little to address his tendency towards procrastination, or, as he put it, starting is always easy, finishing is harder. I have a sort of messy, sprawling technique of writing in which you throw all of this stuff at a wall, and then you just chip away and spiral inwards and try and find the centre. I remember talking to George Martin about this as a sort of production technique, and he was appalled at the waste involved. He could only envisage having a different result in mind, which you went straight to, and you knew how to get there. I've tried that too, but I'm not very good at it. The sprawling approach would simply not have been possible without the instant access and other capabilities of digital.
I think all the computer stuff has affected the writing. I mean, the ease with which you can change things and try ideas. So, I mean, generally, music when I started was about what you could achieve, that you could generate yourself. And now it's much more what you can conceive of. We always seem to be trying to push the technology one stage further than it's ready for. So there's a lot of time sitting around while computers get fixed. But the possibilities are fantastic. So I think there is that shift away from physical technique towards ideas that has happened as a result of the technology. You have now not just the musicians that you happen to know or can afford to pay, but a huge range of sounds at your disposal. So the process of how you make decisions becomes much more critical. And I guess that's something which also slows me down.
However, some analogue was used in the project, as Chappell explained at the time. Sometimes we couldn't get enough tracks out of Pro Tools for multi-channel sessions, so they were initially recorded to the digital Sony 3348 HR48 track or the analog Studer 82024 track tape recorders. We often use the Studer as a processor, kind of like an offline plugin. We took things out of Pro Tools, put them on the Studer, and messed with the vari-speed, reversed things, and so on. There's a real quality that you get from analog that's beautiful and nice. It's not an arty way of talking about it, it's the truth. The writing room also had a 32-channel Neve 33 series desk, and its 33 797 modules were used as mic amps. Chappell recorded Gabriel's voice with a Sony C800 valve mic in combination with a Shure SM58. The album was mixed by Chad Blake in Real World's main studio using a G-Series SSL that was there at the time, and mixing from the Studer 3348 and Studer A820 tape recorders, to which Chappell had transferred all the material. Gabriel's new album was finally released in September 2002. He commented on his newest two-letter title in various interviews.
Up was conceived as a title about 8 years ago, I think. I had a lot of material even then, and it was still quite a lot of it was quite positive, and I was thinking about rivers and also playing with up the Khyber, up the Ganges, up the Mississippi series, where I would send the record off to a group in different countries and they would do their interpretation of it, and then we'd try and sort of pull something together out of that or put those out as individual things. So it was a sort of Up package.
Up was commercially far less successful than Us, though still reaching to number 9 in the UK and number 11 in the US. Critical reaction was lukewarm, with one calling it out of touch. However, there are many fans who regard it as one of his best albums. Up, in many ways, harks back to the experimental prog rock of Gabriel's third and fourth solo albums, and there are rich pickings with the aggressive opener Darkness and songs like Growing Up, Sky Blue, and More Than This. Gabriel toured Up with a spectacular live show, with One of many highlights being the moment he and his daughter Melanie were walking and singing literally upside down during the track Downside Up. The tour was documented on the DV's Growing Up Live in 2003 and Still Growing Up Live and Unwrapped 2005. Gabriel's activities had become increasingly disparate in the 20 years since the release of Up. On the musical front, there have been many awards and guest performances, and in 2008 he co-wrote and performed a song for the animated Wall-E movie Down to Earth. It won a Grammy Award for Best Song Written for Motion Picture, Television or Other Visual Media. 2008 also saw the release of Real World's records of Big Blue Ball, which featured music recorded over 3 weeks at Real World Studios in the early 90s, with a variety of artists, including Gabriel, Tim Thin, Carl Wallinger, Jar Wobble, Hossam Ramsey, Natasha Atlas, and many others. It featured 2 songs co-written with Gabriel, Whole Thing and Burn You Up, Burn You Down. As mentioned at the beginning, in 2009, Gabriel released the covers album Scratch My Back. It contained orchestral arrangements by him and John Metcalfe of songs by David Bowie, Lou Reed, Radiohead, Arcade Fire, and others. It reached to number 12 in the UK. He toured the covers album over 2 years with the New Blood tour, and in 2011 released New Blood containing orchestral arrangements of a selection of his own songs. Following this, Gabriel toured So, with the original musicians from the album during a tour called Back to Front. The tour lasted in 2014 and was released as a DVD. 2014 also saw the release of the movie Words with Gods, which included a new track which Gabriel had already performed live during the Back to Front tour called Why Don't You Show Yourself. Gabriel explained that the song was about the search for God.
Why don't you show yourself?
2016 was a busy year for Gabriel. He released 2 new songs that could have been part of I.O. I'm Amazing, inspired by Muhammad Ali, and The Veil, written for the Oliver Stone movie Snowden. Gabriel also was a guest artist on the song AI by One Republic, and started the Rock, Paper, Scissors tour with Sting. In 2019, 2 Gabriel compilation albums were released, furthering the impression that he was slowing down and there might not be another new album. The first was Rated PG, which contained 10 songs Gabriel had written for movies, from Walk Through the Fire for Against All Odds in 1984, via Taboo for Natural Born Killers in 1994, to Every Bird for Birds Like Us in 2017. It turned out that Gabriel had been productive enough over the decades for 7 other songs for film soundtracks to be excluded. Flotsam and Jetsam contains an amazing 62 tracks with 6 hours of music, including B-sides, remixes, soundtrack songs not included on Rated PG, extended versions, single versions, live versions, instrumental versions, dance mixes, and more. Once again, stepping over Gabriel's extensive non-musical activities over the last 2 decades, which include activism in humanitarian and political arenas, as well as investments in a variety of charities and music and technology-related companies, we come to June 2022, when Manu Katché had raised expectations with a semi-official and presumably unauthorized announcement of a new album released. When I asked Tony Levin last summer, he didn't want to say anything definitive other than confirm that sessions had been conducted, starting with a mention of sessions in September of 2021.
We spent last September doing tracks, and I'm not going to be too good a predictor of the future, but I'll tell you what I know. Last September we did wonderful tracks. Peter had about 16 new pieces at an advanced stage, because sometimes Peter has had us come in historically when it was the beginning of an idea. No, they were pretty done. And so at the end of September, I left thinking this could come out 6 months from now, or this could come out 10 years from now, or we could 5 years from now come in to redo it the way it has happened historically a few times. And then in May, I started being called from Peter Gabriel's management about coming in again to Real World Studios to tweak a few pieces that were almost there but needed to be. And so we went back the same band, David Rhodes on guitar, Manu Katché, and me, the old time band. We just are so happy being together musically and personally that it was great. And what I can say about these pieces, I think they're great. I think Peter's voice is better than ever. It was just like it was a joy to hear his vocals, which had already been done on the tracks. So that I know.
This takes us to the momentous day of November the 8th, 2022, when Peter Gabriel officially announced I.O. the Tour with European and American legs. Gabriel fans immediately worried there was still no announcement of the release date for I.O., but the thinking was that these confirmed tour dates would make it impossible for Gabriel to procrastinate any longer. However, with Gabriel having teased news of a release soon after Up, in other words, since 2002, with further updates on I.O. on an almost yearly basis, there was an amazement when, come 2023, he still did not give a definitive release date. Instead, as mentioned at the beginning of this video, Gabriel explained that there will be monthly releases of individual tracks every full moon, with a different mix of the same track released every new moon. The release schedule is set to continue for the whole of 2023.
Every time you look up at the sky and you see the moon getting full, you'll know there's a new track coming out and a new piece of art. We had some band sessions a year ago now. They were a lot of fun, and we had Tony Levin and David Rhodes, Manu Katché back on the drums.
Spike Stent, Britain's #1 pop mixer, with credits like Beyoncé, Coldplay and Muse, is doing what are called the bright side mixes, while Chad Blake, another amazing mixer, also mixed Up and is known for a far grittier mixing style with credits like Arctic Monkeys and Black Keys, is responsible for the dark side mixes. In addition, Hans Martin Buth, who started his career working as an engineer for Prince, is doing immersive inside mixes. On top of this, Gabriel makes full use of the social media environment and downloading and streaming technologies. He is drawing in fans with alternative versions and demos of new songs, mostly released via his fee-paying Bandcamp site. From the videos with which Gabriel has announced some of the new tracks, there is a lot of footage of him, his musicians and his engineers working at Real World. From observing these videos, it seems Gabriel's current rig appears to consist of a Casio LK43 keyboard, Clavier Nord Lead 2 synthesizer, Dave Smith Instruments Prophet 8 synthesizer, Korg Kronos synthesizer, Moog Mini Moog Model D, and he's been seen with Shure Beta 87A and Flea 47 microphones. 4 tracks have so far been released on the first 4 full moons of 2023. Panopticon, The Court, Playing for Time, I.O., and the titles of 3 yet-to-be released tracks are known: 4 Kinds of Horses, Live and Let Live, and Love Can Heal. On the evidence of these 4 tracks released in the time we have made this video, the musical direction is an extension of Up, albeit in many ways gentler and more melodic, while the production is less abrasive. In a recent interview in Uncut magazine, Gabriel explains that his writing process is still similar to in the past. I'd say 80% of my go-to is the piano or rhythm machine. As an old drummer, a groove will still get me going. But sometimes a sound will trigger something and take you somewhere else. One of the things that tech has given us is very fast access to huge amounts of sound. He also said about the tensions between high-tech and traditional approaches that underlies his music still exist. In this case of I.O., it means, says Gabriel, that the record sounds very different track by track. I think some styles still feel more futuristic, some retro and some textural. The album has quite a lot of different colours. There are 4 or 5 up-tempo songs. It depends on what ends up being chosen for the album. There are still quite a few question marks. I may just keep going. Gabriel's hints that he may continue releasing 1 song every full moon even after the world of I.O. has been released. With Gabriel also touring for a large part of the year, fans may find 2023 to be the most exciting year of Gabriel's career, in which there is more new music, and he engages with his audience more than ever before. All of this is obviously made possible by the latest technology, and while it may seem odd that for a man of 73 to be at the forefront of it, his leading position is entirely in line with the rest of his rich and varied career. during which he has consistently been an innovator, and even managed for a while to combine his vanguard role with that of being a global pop star. I don't know what else to say. Everything we've talked about here, I am massively passionate about. Peter Gabriel, to me, is the artist's artist. One thing I never hear about him and that I love is the word perfectionist, because perfectionist to me implies somebody who overthinks. I don't think he overthinks. I think he's pushing the boundaries. This sort of chaotic way that he describes throwing things against a wall and then spiraling, taking from the inside, working out, actually makes sense to me, because I think he's continually trying to find something different. If there's one thing that I will always say about Peter Gabriel, is he is never boring. He has never been boring. There is nothing that Peter Gabriel has done that I just go, next. Everything he does, he challenges himself and he challenges the listener. And sometimes it's pure pop majesty, such as, of course, So, and other times like Melt, it's just ridiculous. I go back and I listen to Melt all the time. I've listened to Intruder, we listened to it today earlier, but I will listen to that album once every couple of days. I will drive to that album. I will reference it while making records. There are things that he has done through his solo career and, of course, his incredible work with Genesis as well, which I believe are some of the greatest pieces of recorded music ever. He employs the greatest musicians. Tony Levin, of course, is one of the most creative bass players. And it is no surprise when I interviewed Tony, when I asked him about whether he was imitating a synth with these effects because he wanted to compete with synthesizers, he sort of thought about it for a couple of seconds and he said, no, I just want every sound, every part to be unique for the song. And that's no small accident. When you're working with somebody like Peter Gabriel, of his kind of talent, of his drive, of his creativity, you've got to be up there and match it. And Tony Levin, like Manu Katché, and all of these other incredible musicians and producers and engineers that have worked with Peter, they all bring their A game. This is some of the greatest music ever made. I will argue that till the cows come home. Peter Gabriel is, you know what? Peter Gabriel is a decent human being. He's a great man. He goes out of his way to help people, to bring cases, to bring things to light that other people would never talk about, especially in this day and age of political correctness all over the place. Nobody ever wants to talk about anything that might upset anybody. That's the way to make money, apparently, is to make sure everybody is always happy. Well, you know what? Peter Gabriel doesn't care about that. Peter Gabriel was singing about Biko at a time when it wasn't really an issue. It was sort of ignored. And I'll tell you, as a kid, when that came out, everybody in my school was talking about that. Everybody. And the fact that it combined with Two Tone from 2 years before and Scar and what that did for us as well, bringing people together, it was perfect. And I don't know, to me, that's an artist. An artist has something to say. And we've talked about this many times in many, many videos, that great art has to be great art on all levels. For me, I want the great songs, the great performances, the great production, but I also want lyrics that mean something and that kick down doors and break down barriers. And Peter Gabriel, even at his poppiest, was able to do that. So thank you, Peter, for incredible music. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please leave any comments and questions below. And of course, any other suggestions for other artists for us to cover. We have a few in the works. It takes a long time to research this and get it all done, but I love doing it. So please give us so many comments and questions, and other artists, bands, albums, singles, EPs, you name it. Thanks, everyone. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, tot ziens, ciao, tschüss, au revoir, goodbye.